Billionaire spills wine, tells Janitor to clean. She has no idea he's the owner. Just before we start, drop a flag emoji that represents your country. The crystal chandelier above the Harrison Industries reception area cast dancing shadows across the polished marble floor, its light refracting through the burgundy liquid that now spread like spilled blood across the pristine white surface. Victoria Hayes stood frozen, her Louboutin heel hovering above the puddle, her perfectly manicured hand still clutching the stem of the now empty wine glass. Her emerald eyes, cold as winter frost, locked onto the man in the gray janitor's uniform, who had just rounded the corner with his cleaning cart. "Well?" Victoria's voice sliced through the hushed lobby like a blade. "Don't just stand there gaping, clean it now." Marcus Bennett, 34 years old with shoulders that had carried more than anyone in this building could imagine, pushed his cart forward slowly. His daughter Emma, 7 years old with her father's warm brown eyes and a mind that processed the world in ways that left teachers speechless, sat on the lobby's leather bench where he'd settled her just moments before. She was supposed to be reading her chapter book, but her gaze was fixed on the scene unfolding before her small hands gripping the book's edges until her knuckles turned white. "I said now, or would you prefer I call security?" Victoria's tone dripped with contempt as she examined her silk blouse for any stray droplets. At 27, she'd climbed to the CEO position of Harrison Industries' West Coast division in record time, and she wore her authority like armor. "Actually, better yet, clean this mess before I have you fired. Do you understand me, or do I need to speak slower?" The reception staff had gone silent. Janet Morrison, the 58-year-old head receptionist who'd worked at Harrison Industries for 30 years, felt her stomach twist. She'd seen this young CEO tear through 3 assistants in 2 months, but this casual cruelty toward the cleaning staff struck a different chord. The new janitor, Marcus she'd learned his name was, had only been working here for 6 weeks. He kept to himself, arrived early, left late, and his daughter sometimes waited for him in the lobby. Always quiet, always reading books far too advanced for her age. Marcus knelt down, pulling out his supplies without a word. His movements were methodical, practiced, though something in the set of his jaw suggested restraint rather than submission. As he began wiping up the wine, Victoria stepped back, her nose wrinkling as if his proximity offended her. "Pathetic," she muttered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "This is exactly why people end up where they are. No ambition, no drive, just—" She gestured dismissively. "This." Emma stood up from the bench, her small frame rigid with an emotion she was too young to fully name but old enough to feel burning in her chest. Marcus glanced up sharply, catching her eye, and gave the slightest shake of his head. His daughter understood the silent command and sat back down, but her eyes never left her father's face. "Oh, how sweet." Victoria noticed the exchange, her lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. "Bring your daughter to work day? That's precious. Maybe she can learn what happens when you settle for mediocrity." She leaned down slightly, her voice dropping to a stage whisper everyone could still hear. "Here's a life lesson, honey. Study hard so you don't end up like Daddy here, cleaning up other people's messes." The lobby could have been a tomb for how silent it became. Even the usual hum of the building's ventilation system seemed to fade into the background. Janet Morrison's hand moved toward her phone, torn between calling security and calling her supervisor, knowing either choice could make things worse. Marcus continued cleaning, each stroke of his cloth deliberate and thorough. When he'd soaked up the last of the wine, he stood, disposed of the soiled materials, and pulled out a specialized solution to address the potential staining on the marble. His movements never hurried, never showed the reaction Victoria seemed to be baiting for. "Sir," Emma's voice was small but clear, carrying across the lobby with unexpected authority. "May I use the restroom?" "Down the hall, sweetheart," Marcus replied, his voice carrying none of the strain that showed in the tendons of his neck. "You remember where?" Emma nodded and stood, walking past Victoria with her chin raised, her backpack clutched against her chest. The 7-year-old's eyes met the CEO's for just a moment, and in that brief connection, Victoria saw something that made her blink. Not fear, not admiration, but a kind of knowing assessment that seemed impossible from a child. As Emma disappeared down the corridor, Victoria turned her attention back to Marcus. "I want this floor spotless. If there's even a hint of a stain tomorrow morning, I'll make sure you're looking for a new job. Am I clear?" "Crystal," Marcus said quietly, meeting her eyes for the first time. For just a heartbeat, Victoria felt something shift in the air between them, a flicker of something in his gaze that made her silk blouse suddenly feel too tight. But then he looked away, returning to his work, and the moment passed. Victoria turned on her heel and strode toward the elevator bank, her heels clicking against the marble like gunshots. As the elevator doors closed behind her, Janet Morrison exhaled the breath she'd been holding and moved quickly toward Marcus. "I'm so sorry," she whispered urgently. "She's been like this since they promoted her last year. Nobody knows where she came from or who sponsored her rise, but she's untouchable. Are you okay?" Marcus looked up at her, and Janet was struck by the composure in his face. This wasn't a man who'd been beaten down by humiliation. This was a man who'd chosen not to react. "I'm fine, Mrs. Morrison. Thank you for your concern." He returned to buffing the floor, his movements precise and professional. Janet wanted to say more, wanted to offer comfort or solidarity, but something in his bearing suggested he needed neither. She returned to her desk, troubled by the scene she'd witnessed and the strange calm of the man at its center. When Emma returned from the restroom, she settled back onto the bench without a word. Her father glanced at her, and she gave him a small smile that said everything was okay. They had a language of their own, these two, built over years of being each other's only family. As Marcus finished treating the marble and packed up his cart, the evening shift workers began trickling into the building. They nodded at him in passing, some offering sympathetic looks that suggested word of the incident had already spread through the staff network. Marcus acknowledged each greeting with quiet dignity, never hurrying, never hiding. "Ready to go home, Princess?" he asked Emma as he completed his final inspection of the floor. "Yes, sir," she replied, standing and shouldering her backpack with the kind of careful precision that mirrored her father's movements. They walked toward the service exit together, Marcus's hand resting gently on his daughter's shoulder. Neither of them looked back at the gleaming lobby or the receptionist who watched them go with troubled eyes. What none of them could see was the figure watching from the 38th floor, standing at a window with a view of the lobby's reflection in the building across the street. Thomas Harrison, founder and chairman of Harrison Industries, lowered his binoculars slowly, his weathered face unreadable in the dimming light. At 73, he'd built an empire, but he'd also learned that empires could crumble from within. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he'd memorized decades ago. "It started," he said simply when the line connected. She took the bait. "And Marcus?" the voice on the other end asked. "Played his part perfectly, like he always does." Thomas Harrison turned away from the window, moving toward his desk where a file folder lay open. Inside were photographs, documents, and a timeline that stretched back 7 years to a night when everything changed. "But we have a problem." "What kind of problem?" "The girl saw everything, and you know as well as I do that child doesn't forget anything." The line went quiet for a moment. "Is that a problem, Thomas? Or is that an opportunity?" Harrison looked at one of the photographs in the file, a younger Marcus Bennett in a very different kind of suit, standing in front of a building that bore his name, his daughter in his arms, both of them smiling at the camera. That building was gone now. That company was gone, that life was gone. But the man remained, and that man was far more dangerous than Victoria Hayes could possibly understand. "I suppose," Thomas said slowly. "That depends entirely on what Marcus decides to do when the truth comes out." "And when will that be?" "Soon, very soon. Victoria's getting sloppy, arrogant. She'll make a mistake, and when she does, we'll be ready." The voice finished for him. Thomas ended the call and returned to the window. Far below, the evening lights of the city were beginning to sparkle to life, each one a small defiance against the approaching darkness. Somewhere out there, Marcus Bennett was taking his daughter home, helping her with homework, reading her a bedtime story, living a life that looked nothing like the one he'd built and lost. But Thomas Harrison knew better than anyone that appearances were the greatest deceptions of all. Marcus Bennett wasn't just a janitor any more than Victoria Hayes was just a CEO. They were players in a game that had started long before either of them walked into this building, and the stakes were higher than any of them fully understood. Not yet, anyway. The apartment Marcus and Emma called home sat on the 4th floor of a modest building, in a neighborhood where people minded their own business, and landlords didn't ask too many questions as long as the rent arrived on time. The 2-bedroom unit was clean, sparse, and filled with an odd collection of items that didn't quite fit together. Expensive hardcover books next to cheap particle board shelves, a state-of-the-art laptop on a second-hand desk, Emma's room with an advanced computer setup that seemed wildly out of place next to her thrift store bed frame. Emma sat at the kitchen table, her mathematics workbook open in front of her, but her pencil hadn't moved in 5 minutes. Marcus stood at the stove, stirring a pot of pasta sauce he'd made from scratch that morning before his shift. The silence between them was comfortable but charged with unspoken thoughts. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was soft, uncertain in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. "Yes, baby girl? Why did that lady talk to you like that?" Marcus turned off the heat under the sauce and moved to sit across from his daughter. At 7 years old, Emma had already learned more about human cruelty than most children twice her age. But this had been different. This had been personal, witnessed, and impossibly difficult to explain. "Some people," Marcus began carefully, choosing his words with the same precision he applied to everything else, "measure a person's worth by what they see on the surface. Their job, their clothes, how much money they have. They don't look deeper. But you always told me that's wrong." "It is wrong. Then why do you let her think you're just a janitor?" The question came out sharper than Emma probably intended, frustration bleeding through her usually careful control. Marcus reached across the table and took his daughter's small hand in his larger one. "Do you remember what I taught you about chess?" Emma nodded slowly. "You said the most powerful pieces sometimes need to move like pawns to get where they're going." "Exactly. And what else did I say?" "That if your opponent underestimates you, they've already lost half the battle." Emma's brown eyes widened with sudden understanding. "You want her to think you're weak." "Not weak, sweetheart, invisible. There's a difference." Marcus squeezed her hand gently. "People say things around someone they think doesn't matter. They make mistakes. They get comfortable and careless. Are you looking for something?" Marcus hesitated. This was the dangerous line they walked together, the boundary between protecting his daughter's childhood and acknowledging her exceptional ability to see patterns others missed. Emma had tested at a cognitive level that put her in the 99th percentile, but numbers on a test couldn't capture the true nature of her gift. She saw connections, remembered details with photographic precision, and understood complex systems with an intuition that sometimes frightened even Marcus. "I'm looking for the truth," he finally said, "about what happened to us, about who took everything we had. And you think that lady knows?" "I think she's part of a chain. Maybe an important part, maybe not. But every link I find brings me closer to the person at the end." Emma absorbed this information with the same serious expression she wore when solving advanced mathematical proofs. "The lady was mean to you because she thinks she has power, but she doesn't know you're the one who's really in control." Something like that. "Will you tell her eventually?" "When the time is right." Emma returned to her homework, but Marcus could see the wheels turning in her mind. His daughter didn't just accept information. She processed it, filed it away, connected it to other pieces of the puzzle she was constantly assembling about their lives. They ate dinner together at the small kitchen table, Emma telling him about the book she was reading, a college-level text on behavioral economics she'd found at the library. Marcus listened, asked questions, and marveled as always at the extraordinary mind housed in such a small person. She was his miracle, his purpose, the reason he got up every morning and pushed a cleaning cart through buildings he used to own. After dinner, while Emma worked on a coding project she'd assigned herself, Marcus retreated to his bedroom and pulled out a laptop from beneath his mattress. The device was protected by 3 layers of encryption and connected to the internet through a series of proxies that would be nearly impossible to trace. He opened a folder labeled Timeline and began reviewing his notes. 7 years ago, Marcus Bennett had been the CEO of Bennett Technologies, a rising star in the tech industry with a company valued at $800 million. He'd had everything: wealth, respect, a beautiful home, and most importantly, a 3-year-old daughter who was just beginning to show signs of the remarkable mind she'd inherited from her mother. Then came the collapse. A whistleblower report claiming Bennett Technologies had falsified its financial statements. Federal investigators descending on the company. Assets frozen, accounts seized. Marcus's wife, Emma's mother, leaving in the middle of the night with whatever liquid cash she could grab, abandoning both her husband and her daughter without a backward glance. The investigation had eventually cleared Marcus of any wrongdoing, but by then the damage was done. The company was bankrupt. His reputation was destroyed. His wealth was gone, consumed by legal fees and debt. He'd kept only what he could hide, enough to provide a modest life for Emma and himself, and enough to fund his investigation into who had actually orchestrated his fall. Because Marcus knew with absolute certainty that he'd been framed. The evidence had been too perfect, too complete, too conveniently timed with a hostile takeover attempt by a consortium of investors. When the smoke cleared, Bennett Technologies' assets had been purchased for pennies on the dollar by a holding company that dissolved 6 months later, its pieces scattered across a dozen different corporate entities. For 7 years, Marcus had tracked those pieces. He'd worked his way through the corporate landscape in positions no one noticed: janitor, maintenance worker, night security guard. He'd moved from city to city, company to company, following the trail of his stolen empire. And 3 months ago, that trail had led him here to Harrison Industries. The file open on his screen contained years of research. Thomas Harrison, the founder, was clean, a hard-nosed businessman but honest by industry standards. His son Richard, who'd run the company until his death in a car accident 5 years ago, had been similarly legitimate. But Richard's widow, Carolyn Harrison, who'd inherited Richard's shares and board seat, was a different story. Her financial records showed payments to a consulting firm that Marcus had traced back to the same network of shell companies that had acquired his assets. And then there was Victoria Hayes, 27 years old. No significant work history before joining Harrison Industries 18 months ago as a junior executive, promoted to division CEO after just 6 months, sponsored for the position by Carolyn Harrison herself. Victoria's background was surprisingly sparse: a mediocre college degree, no family connections that Marcus could find, no obvious explanation for her meteoric rise. But most interesting was a photograph Marcus had found buried in an old social media archive. Victoria Hayes at a charity gala 6 years ago, before her career transformation, before she became a CEO. She was standing in a group of people that included someone Marcus recognized: David Chen, the venture capitalist who'd led the consortium that tried to take over Bennett Technologies. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even close to proof. But it was a thread, and Marcus had learned that if you pulled threads carefully enough, eventually the whole fabric unraveled. A soft knock on his bedroom door pulled him from his research. "Daddy, can I show you what I coded?" Marcus closed the laptop quickly and opened the door. Emma stood in the hallway in her pajamas, her tablet in hand, her face lit with the particular excitement she got when she'd solved a problem. "Show me, princess." They settled on his bed together, and Emma pulled up a program she'd written. "It's a pattern recognition algorithm," she explained. "You can feed it data about people, where they go, who they talk to, what they buy, and it predicts their connections to other people. See?" She demonstrated with example data, the screen filling with a web of relationships and probability scores. Marcus stared at the program, his mind racing. "Emma, this is really advanced work. I thought it might help you," she said quietly, "with what you're looking for." He pulled his daughter close, emotion tightening his throat. "You're supposed to be a kid, baby girl. You're supposed to worry about homework and friends and cartoons. I do worry about those things, but I also worry about you. And I'm good at this. Really good." She looked up at him with those wise, ancient eyes. "I want to help." Marcus knew he should say no, knew he should keep her as far away from his investigation as possible. But he also knew his daughter, knew that telling her not to use her gifts was like telling the ocean not to have waves. She would help whether he wanted her to or not. Better that he guide her than leave her to navigate dangerous waters alone. "Okay," he said finally. "But you have to promise me something. You never, ever tell anyone about this. Not teachers, not friends, not anyone. Can you promise me that?" "I promise." They spent the next hour working together, Emma showing him how her algorithm functioned while Marcus fed it information from his research. The program identified connections Marcus had missed, suggested relationships he hadn't considered. It was powerful, potentially dangerous, and created by a 7-year-old who should have been worrying about multiplication tables. When Emma finally yawned, Marcus shut down the tablet and tucked her into bed. He read her a chapter from the economics book she'd requested, then kissed her forehead and turned off the light. "Daddy?" Her voice came from the darkness. "That lady today, Victoria, she's going to be important, isn't she, to what you're doing?" "I think so, yes." "Good." There was a satisfaction in Emma's voice that made Marcus uneasy. "I didn't like how she talked to you." "Emma, this isn't about revenge. I know it's about truth, you said so." A pause. "But truth can hurt people who deserve to be hurt, right?" Marcus closed his eyes, torn between pride in his daughter's razor-sharp mind and fear for the darkness that might be growing in her heart. "Get some sleep, princess. Tomorrow's a school day." He returned to his room and the laptop, but before diving back into his research, he opened a different file. This one contained photographs from another life: Marcus in a tailored suit, Emma as a toddler, a beautiful home, a life that felt like it belonged to someone else now. He'd kept the photos not from nostalgia but as a reminder of what he'd had, what he'd lost, and what he was fighting to reclaim. Not the money, though, that would be nice. Not the status, though, that would be convenient. What Marcus wanted more than anything was the truth. He wanted to know who had destroyed him, and he wanted them to understand that destroying someone doesn't mean they stay destroyed. Tomorrow he would return to Harrison Industries. He would push his cart, clean floors, empty trash bins, and watch. Always watching. Because somewhere in that building was the key to everything, and Victoria Hayes's careless cruelty had convinced him more than ever that she was involved. She'd humiliated him today, because she thought he was beneath her notice. She'd learn eventually that the greatest mistake a predator can make is assuming the prey isn't watching back. Marcus closed the laptop and prepared for bed, but sleep was elusive. His mind kept replaying the scene in the lobby, not dwelling on the humiliation, but analyzing every detail. Victoria's confidence, the way she'd looked at Emma with disdain, the casual cruelty that suggested she'd never faced real consequences for her actions. That would change. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next month, but eventually, inevitably, it would change. Because Marcus Bennett had nothing but time, nothing but patience, and nothing but the cold, focused determination of a man who'd already lost everything once and knew he had nothing left to fear. In her bedroom down the hall, Emma lay awake too, her mind processing the events of the day through the lens of her exceptional intellect. She'd created her algorithm not just to help her father, but because she understood something he perhaps didn't fully appreciate. Patterns were everywhere, and if you could see them clearly enough, you could predict the future. And the pattern Emma saw, the one her father couldn't quite grasp yet, was that Victoria Hayes was going to be their catalyst. Not an enemy, not a target, but the spark that would ignite the fire that brought everything into the light. Emma smiled in the darkness, already planning her next program, her next analysis. Her father thought he was protecting her by keeping his investigation carefully controlled. But Emma Bennett, 7 years old with the mind of a grandmaster, had her own plans. And unlike her father, who was willing to wait years for justice, Emma's timeline was considerably shorter. After all, she'd already figured out something Marcus hadn't yet realized. Victoria Hayes wasn't just connected to the people who'd destroyed them. Victoria Hayes was the key to everything. And keys, Emma knew, could open doors, or they could break in the lock. The question was, which would happen first? The morning sun cut through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria Hayes's corner office on the 38th floor, illuminating the space like a stage. She stood at the glass, coffee in hand, surveying the city below, with the satisfaction of someone who'd fought for every inch of her view and won. At 27, she was the youngest division CEO in Harrison Industries history, and she'd earned that position through a combination of calculated risks, strategic alliances, and an absolute refusal to let sentiment interfere with ambition. Her phone buzzed. A text from Carolyn Harrison. Board meeting at 10. Be prepared to present Q3 projections. Victoria smiled. Carolyn had been her sponsor, her mentor, the woman who'd seen potential in a nobody from nowhere and provided the opportunity Victoria had seized with both hands. In 18 months, she'd transformed a struggling division into a profit center, and she'd done it by making the hard decisions others were too weak to make. Cutting staff, renegotiating contracts, pushing for efficiency over comfort. She thought briefly about the janitor from yesterday, the pathetic man she'd dressed down in the lobby. Had she been harsh? Perhaps. But Victoria had learned young that showing weakness invited exploitation. Better to be feared than liked. Better to establish dominance immediately than waste time building rapport with people who were fundamentally beneath her notice. The intercom buzzed. Ms. Hayes, your 9 o'clock is here. Send them in. Victoria turned from the window as her door opened. David Chen, 43 years old with silver at his temples and the predatory confidence of a venture capitalist who'd never lost, entered with his characteristic swagger. He'd been Victoria's secret weapon. The man who'd connected her to the right people opened the right doors. Their relationship was complicated. Part mentor, part employer, part something else neither of them fully acknowledged. Victoria. David's smile didn't reach his eyes as he settled into one of her guest chairs uninvited. Lovely performance yesterday. The whole building's talking about it. She felt a flicker of annoyance. I assume you're not here to critique my management style. Actually, that's exactly why I'm here. David leaned back, crossing his legs. Carolyn called me. She's concerned you're becoming too visible, too aggressive. The incident with the janitor was witnessed by a dozen people, And stories like that have a way of spreading. I disciplined an employee for, "You humiliated a man in front of his child." David's voice was sharp. "There's a difference between being tough and being cruel, and you crossed that line. Carolyn wants you to apologize." Victoria laughed, genuine amusement coloring her voice. "Apologize? To a janitor? You can't be serious." "I'm very serious. You're becoming a liability, Victoria. The board already questions some of Carolyn's decisions in promoting you so quickly. They're watching for any excuse to undermine her position, and by extension, yours." David leaned forward. "So yes, you're going to find that janitor. You're going to apologize sincerely, and you're going to make it clear that Harrison Industries values all its employees. Consider it an investment in your political capital." The words stung more than Victoria wanted to admit. She'd worked so hard to build her armor, to become the kind of person who couldn't be pushed around or dismissed. But David was right. Appearing too ruthless could backfire. The key was maintaining the reality of power, while projecting an image of benevolent leadership. "Fine," she said coolly. "I'll handle it today." "Good. Now on to more important matters." David pulled out his phone and swiped through several screens before showing her a photograph. "Recognize this man?" Victoria studied the image. It showed a younger man in an expensive suit, confident and successful, standing in front of a building with a company logo she didn't recognize. "Should I?" "His name is Marcus Bennett. 7 years ago he was the CEO of Bennett Technologies, valued at $800 million. Then his company collapsed amid a fraud scandal, and he lost everything." David's smile was predatory. "Everything." Something cold slithered down Victoria's spine. "Why are you showing me this?" "Because Marcus Bennett is working in this building right now, as a janitor." The coffee cup in Victoria's hand suddenly felt too heavy. The man from yesterday? The very same. David stood and moved to her window, hands clasped behind his back. 7 years ago, I led a consortium that attempted to acquire Bennett Technologies during his scandal. We ultimately succeeded in buying the assets for a fraction of their value. Those assets formed the foundation of what eventually became Harrison Industries' most profitable subsidiaries. Victoria's mind was racing, connecting dots she didn't want to connect. "You're saying he's here because he's smart enough to trace what happened to his company, and that trail led him here." David turned to face her. "The question is, what does he know? What has he figured out? And most importantly, what does he plan to do about it? If he knew anything substantial, he'd have gone to the authorities, filed lawsuits, something." Victoria was trying to sound confident, but uncertainty crept into her voice. "Unless he's gathering evidence. Unless he's patient enough to build an airtight case before making his move." David returned to his chair. "I've had people watching him for the past month since we identified him. He lives modestly, works his shifts, spends his off hours with his daughter. But here's the interesting part. His daughter is special. Special how? Cognitively gifted doesn't begin to cover it. The girl tested at levels that put her in the top fraction of a percent worldwide. She's 7 years old and reading college-level material. Her school has flagged her for accelerated programs. But Bennett keeps refusing, keeps her in normal classes." David's expression was thoughtful. "A man with nothing to hide doesn't try so hard to keep his exceptional child invisible." Victoria moved to her desk, needing the physical barrier between herself and this conversation. "What do you want me to do?" "Watch him. Report anything unusual. And for God's sake, stop antagonizing him." David stood, buttoning his jacket. "Oh, and Victoria? When you apologize to him, make it good. Sincere. Because if Marcus Bennett is half as smart as I think he is, he'll be studying your every reaction, looking for cracks in your facade." After David left, Victoria sat at her desk for a long time, staring at nothing. The victory she'd felt this morning had curdled into something sour. She'd humiliated a man yesterday without knowing his story, without realizing that underneath his janitor's uniform might be someone far more dangerous than she'd imagined. She pulled up the employee database and found Marcus Bennett's file. Hired 6 weeks ago through a temp agency. Background check cleared. References verified. Nothing remarkable except a note that he'd specifically requested shifts that allowed him to pick up his daughter from school. Victoria studied his employee photo. The man looked back at her with calm, unrevealing eyes. How had she missed it yesterday? That stillness in his posture, that quiet dignity that suggested he was playing a role rather than living his reality. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Carolyn. "David briefed me. Handle this carefully, Victoria. We have too much at stake." Victoria replied, "Understood, we'll address immediately." Will. She stood, smoothed her skirt, and headed for the elevator. According to the schedule, Marcus Bennett would be on the 23rd floor right now, cleaning the executive washrooms. Time to make her apology and assess just how much danger she was actually in. The 23rd floor was quiet this early. Most executives not yet arrived for the day. Victoria found Marcus methodically wiping down mirrors in the men's room, his daughter Emma sitting in the hallway outside, legs swinging from a bench, absorbed in yet another advanced textbook. "Mr. Bennett?" Victoria's voice was carefully modulated, stripped of yesterday's contempt. Marcus turned slowly, his expression neutral. "Ms. Hayes, may I speak with you for a moment?" He glanced at his daughter, who looked up from her book with those unsettling eyes. "Emma, wait here, please." They stepped into an empty conference room. Through the glass walls, Victoria could see Emma watching them, her book forgotten, her entire attention focused on their interaction. It was unnerving, like being observed by something far older and more calculating than a 7-year-old should be. "I owe you an apology," Victoria began, and she was surprised to find that part of her meant it. "My behavior yesterday was inappropriate and unprofessional. I was stressed, which is no excuse, and I took that stress out on you. I'm sorry." Marcus studied her for a long moment. "Apology accepted. I'd also like to assure you that your position here is secure. What happened yesterday won't affect your employment." "I appreciate that, Ms. Hayes." The conversation felt wrong, stilted, like two actors reading lines neither believed. Victoria found herself wishing she could see behind Marcus's carefully controlled expression, wanting to know what he was really thinking. "Your daughter," she said, changing tactics. "She seems very mature for her age." Something flickered in Marcus's eyes. Protective instinct, immediate and fierce. "Emma is exceptional, yes. I hope my comments yesterday didn't upset her. That wasn't my intention. Children are resilient. She'll be fine." But even as Marcus said the words, both of them knew it was a lie. Emma Bennett didn't look like a child who needed resilience because nothing affected her. She looked like a child who was cataloging information, filing away every detail for future use. "Well," Victoria said, feeling oddly dismissed despite being the one who held all the official power in this room, "I should let you get back to work. Again, my sincere apologies." "Thank you, Ms. Hayes. I appreciate you taking the time." They returned to the hallway where Emma sat watching them approach. As Victoria walked past, heading toward the elevator, she felt the little girl's eyes on her back. She resisted the urge to look over her shoulder, to see what expression might be on that unnaturally composed face. In the conference room, through the glass walls, she saw Marcus kneel down to his daughter's level. They spoke briefly, Emma's hands moving in animated gestures, Marcus listening with complete attention. It was such a simple scene, father and daughter, quiet moment in a busy building. But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just been assessed, judged, and found wanting by both of them. She entered the elevator and pressed the button for her floor, her mind churning. David was right to be concerned. Marcus Bennett wasn't just a janitor enduring his circumstances. He was a man on a mission, and Victoria had just made herself memorable to him in the worst possible way. The elevator doors closed, but Victoria's troubled reflection stared back at her from the polished metal, and for the first time in years, she questioned whether climbing to the top had been worth the view. Back in the hallway, Emma watched the elevator disappear, then turned to her father. "She's scared," the little girl said simply. "I know, Princess." "Good," Emma replied, returning to her book. But Marcus noticed she wasn't actually reading anymore. She was thinking, and when Emma Bennett started thinking, the world had a way of shifting to accommodate whatever conclusion she reached. Marcus returned to his cleaning, but his mind was elsewhere. Victoria's apology had been interesting, part genuine, part performance, part something else he couldn't quite identify. She'd been warned about him, that much was obvious. Someone had told her who he used to be, which meant his cover was compromised, but perhaps not fatally. As long as they thought he was just gathering evidence, just building a case, they wouldn't panic. They wouldn't realize that Marcus had moved past evidence months ago. What he was doing now was far more dangerous than collecting proof. He was studying them, learning their patterns, their relationships, their vulnerabilities. Because Marcus had learned the hard way that courts and lawyers and official channels could be corrupted, could be manipulated by people with enough money and power. Justice through legal means had failed him once. He wouldn't make that mistake again. This time, when he moved against the people who'd destroyed him, it would be total, comprehensive, and absolutely devastating. Not just revenge, reconstruction. He would take back everything they'd stolen, piece by piece until they understood exactly what they'd taken from him. And Victoria Hayes, with her designer suits and casual cruelty, was about to learn that the man she'd humiliated in her lobby wasn't the broken victim of circumstances. He was the architect of her destruction, and he'd just been given permission to get closer. Marcus smiled to himself as he moved to the next washroom. Yes, Victoria's apology had been very interesting indeed, because in trying to neutralize a threat, she'd instead confirmed everything Marcus needed to know. They were afraid, which meant they had reason to be afraid, which meant he was getting close. Emma looked up from her book one more time, catching her father's eye. He gave her a subtle nod, and she returned it, a complete conversation passing between them in that simple gesture. The game had changed. The pieces were moving, and neither Marcus nor Emma Bennett were content to simply be pawns anymore. It was time to start playing to win. 3 weeks after Victoria's apology, the dynamics at Harrison Industries had shifted in ways both subtle and profound. Marcus Bennett continued his janitorial duties with the same quiet efficiency, but now there was an awareness among the executive staff that hadn't existed before. People nodded at him in hallways. Victoria made a point of saying good morning when their paths crossed, the performance of respect without its substance. Emma had started bringing her laptop to the building, working on increasingly sophisticated programs while her father completed his shifts. Janet Morrison, the head receptionist, had taken a grandmotherly interest in the girl, often bringing her cookies and asking about school. Emma accepted the kindness with polite gratitude, but Marcus could see his daughter was distracted, her mind consumed by patterns only she could perceive. On a Thursday evening, as Marcus cleaned the executive floor conference rooms, Emma appeared at his side with her laptop, her expression urgent. "Daddy, I need to show you something." They stepped into an empty office, and Emma pulled up her pattern recognition program. The screen displayed a complex web of financial transactions, color-coded by suspicious activity levels. "I've been analyzing Harrison Industries' financial records," she said, her 7-year-old voice eerily professional. "The public ones, the ones they have to file with the SEC. Emma, where did you learn to access YouTube and library books?" "That's not important." She pointed to a cluster of red nodes on her screen. "Look at these transactions. Every quarter for the past 18 months, Harrison Industries has paid consulting fees to a company called Meridian Strategic Partners. Total payments, $47 million. Marcus leaned closer, his pulse quickening. Meridian. I've seen that name in my research. It's a shell company. No employees, no office, no actual services provided. The payments go in, then they're immediately distributed to 12 different offshore accounts. Emma's fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up another screen. But here's the interesting part. One of those offshore accounts links back to a trust that benefits Victoria Hayes. The room seemed to tilt. Marcus gripped the edge of the desk. "You're certain?" "I'm always certain, Daddy. I triple-checked." Emma looked up at him with those ancient eyes. "Victoria's been stealing from Harrison Industries millions of dollars, and she's been doing it with someone's help, someone who set up the shell company structure. Show me everything." For the next hour, Emma walked him through her discoveries. The financial trail was complex but clear once she mapped it out. Victoria Hayes wasn't just a beneficiary of corporate theft. She was an active participant. The consulting fees were a siphon, slowly draining Harrison Industries while making it appear as legitimate business expenses. But Emma's analysis had uncovered something even more damning. The shell company structure, she explained, pulling up corporate registration documents she had no business being able to access, was created 7 years ago, 3 months before your company collapsed. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. The same network, the same people, same lawyers who filed the paperwork, same offshore banks handling the transactions. Daddy, whoever destroyed Bennett Technologies is the same person helping Victoria steal from Harrison Industries. David Chen, Marcus said quietly. "It has to be him. He led the consortium that bought my assets, and now he's using the same playbook." "There's more." Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "I found communication records, encrypted emails between Victoria and someone using the handle Phoenix. They've been planning something big, something that happens next month." "What kind of something?" "They're going to manufacture a scandal. Make it look like Thomas Harrison, the founder, has been embezzling money. The board will force him out. Carolyn Harrison will take full control, and she'll immediately sell the company to a buyer who's already lined up." Emma met her father's gaze. "They're going to do to Thomas Harrison exactly what they did to you." Marcus straightened, his mind racing through implications and possibilities. This changed everything. He'd come here seeking evidence of who destroyed him, but he'd stumbled into an active conspiracy that was about to destroy someone else. The ethical calculation was complex. Thomas Harrison wasn't Marcus's friend. He'd bought some of Bennett Technologies' assets during the fire sale, profiting from Marcus's destruction, but he'd also, according to Marcus's research, been unaware of the conspiracy behind it. Harrison was a legitimate businessman who'd made what he thought was a legitimate acquisition. "We need to warn him," Emma said, reading her father's thoughts as she so often did. "If we warn him, we reveal what we know. Our investigation becomes public. But if we don't warn him, we're letting them do to someone else what they did to us." Emma's voice carried a moral clarity that shamed Marcus's calculated hesitation. "You always said truth matters more than revenge." She was right, of course. His brilliant, ethical, impossibly mature 7-year-old daughter was right. "Okay," Marcus said finally. "But we do this carefully. We need—" The office door opened. Victoria Hayes stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. For a long, frozen moment, nobody moved. Then Victoria stepped inside and closed the door behind her. "I've been watching you," she said quietly. "Both of you. The way you look at people. The questions you ask, the places you position your cleaning cart." Her eyes moved to Emma's laptop. "What did you find?" Marcus moved slightly, positioning himself between Victoria and his daughter. "I don't know what you mean. Please, don't insult my intelligence." Victoria moved to the window, her back to them. "I know who you are, Marcus Bennett. I've known for weeks, and I know you're investigating what happened to your company." She turned to face them. "What you don't know is that I've been investigating too." The admission hung in the air like smoke. Emma's fingers hovered over her keyboard, ready to close her programs, but something in Victoria's body language made her pause. "6 months ago," Victoria continued, "I discovered irregularities in my division's finances. Transactions I didn't authorize, payments to companies I'd never heard of. When I started asking questions, David Chen told me to stop. Said it was above my pay grade. Said I should focus on my division's performance and let the corporate accounting team handle the details. But you didn't stop," Marcus said slowly. "I'm not good at following orders I don't understand." A bitter smile crossed Victoria's face. "I hired a forensic accountant, paid him with my own money, had him look at everything. He found the same things your daughter apparently just found." She gestured to the laptop. "The shell companies, the offshore accounts, the systematic theft. And he found something else." Victoria pulled out her phone and swiped through several screens before showing them a photograph. It was a legal document, a corporate registration form. Meridian Strategic Partners was registered by a law firm called Thornton & Associates. That same firm handled the paperwork when my parents died and left me their estate. Marcus studied the document. I think I've been set up. I think David Chen and Carolyn Harrison have been using me, building a paper trail that makes me look like the mastermind of their embezzlement scheme." Victoria's voice shook slightly. "When this all comes out, when the scandal breaks, I'll be the one who takes the fall. Young, ambitious CEO with no family, no connections, no one to defend her. The perfect scapegoat." Emma was typing frantically, her pattern recognition program processing this new information. "She's right," the little girl said after a moment. "Look at the transaction patterns. Every payment gets routed through accounts that Victoria has authorized access to. If anyone investigates, the trail leads straight to her." "Why are you telling us this?" Marcus asked Victoria. "If you know who I am, you know I have every reason to want you destroyed. Because you also have every reason to want the truth." Victoria met his gaze steadily. "I was cruel to you. I humiliated you. I deserve your anger. But I don't deserve to be framed for crimes I didn't commit by the same people who destroyed you 7 years ago." She moved closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, I'm asking for an alliance. You want to expose who really destroyed Bennett Technologies. I want to prove I'm not the thief they're setting me up to be. We need each other." Marcus looked at his daughter. Emma was studying Victoria with that calculating gaze, processing information, running probabilities. Finally, she nodded slightly. "What exactly are you proposing?" Marcus asked. "I have access to internal systems you don't. I can get communications records, meeting minutes, financial documents that aren't public. You have investigative skills and apparently," she glanced at Emma with something like respect, "exceptional analytical capabilities. Together we can build a case that exposes everyone involved. And when we have that case, we take it to Thomas Harrison directly. He's old school, ethical to a fault. If we can prove his daughter-in-law and his star investor are conspiring to steal from his company and frame me for it, He'll act. Victoria's jaw set. And when he does, they'll fall. All of them. Emma closed her laptop. How do we know this isn't a trap? That you're not working with them to find out what we know? Victoria laughed, a harsh sound without humor. I guess you don't. You'll have to trust me. She looked between father and daughter. I know that's asking a lot, especially from you, Mr. Bennett. I was horrible to you. I looked at you and saw nothing but someone beneath my notice. I was wrong. She paused. My parents were janitors. They worked 3 jobs between them to put me through college. They died in a car accident my junior year, and I spent the next 6 years becoming everything I thought would honor their memory. Successful, powerful, untouchable. Instead, I became cruel. I forgot where I came from. Marcus saw the truth in her eyes, the shame and regret that couldn't be faked. He also saw something else. Determination. Victoria Hayes might have been set up as a scapegoat, but she was nobody's victim. 1 week, he said finally. We worked together for 1 week. You provide documents, we analyze them. If your story checks out, we continue. If it doesn't, you turn everything over to the authorities, and I go down with everyone else. Victoria extended her hand. Deal. Marcus shook it, feeling the firm grip of someone who'd fought for everything she had. Deal. After Victoria left, Emma reopened her laptop and immediately began creating new analytical frameworks. This changes the game, she said. I know. Do you believe her? About her parents? About being set up? Marcus thought about Victoria's face when she'd talked about her mother and father. The raw emotion that had broken through her carefully constructed armor. I think I do. But we verify everything. Always, Emma agreed. They worked for another hour. Emma's programs churning through data while Marcus made notes and connections. The picture emerging was bigger than either of them had initially understood. Bennett Technologies hadn't been an isolated attack. It had been practice. A proof of concept for a scheme that had been running for years, destroying companies and people, enriching a small network of conspirators who hid behind legitimate business practices. And now they had an insider willing to help them expose it all. Whether that insider could be trusted remained to be seen, but Marcus had learned long ago that sometimes you had to take calculated risks. This was one of them. Daddy? Emma's voice was small, uncertain in a way she rarely allowed herself to be. What happens when we expose them? Where will we go? Marcus pulled his daughter close. Wherever we want, Princess, we'll have our lives back, our truth, our justice. And will we have our money back? Our house? Maybe. Probably. But you know what? Even if we don't, Marcus kissed the top of her head. We'll have each other, and we'll have the satisfaction of knowing we beat them. That's worth more than any amount of money. Emma nodded against his chest, but Marcus could feel the tension in her small body. His daughter had grown up in poverty, watching her father clean toilets, living in a small apartment, always aware of what they'd lost. She wanted justice, yes, but she also wanted security, the kind of security that came with money and power, and never having to worry about losing everything again. Marcus understood that desire. He felt it too, but he also knew that revenge taken purely for personal gain was just another form of theft. They were fighting for truth, and if material restoration came with it, that would be a bonus. But the truth itself, that had to be the goal. Outside the window, the city lights blazed against the darkness, each one representing lives being lived, dramas unfolding, people struggling and succeeding and failing. Somewhere out there, David Chen and Carolyn Harrison believed they'd gotten away with their crimes. They believed Marcus Bennett was just a broken man playing janitor, that Victoria Hayes was under control, that their next move would succeed like all the others had. They were wrong, and in the coming weeks, they would learn just how wrong they'd been. Because Marcus Bennett wasn't broken, Victoria Hayes wasn't controlled, and Emma Bennett, 7 years old with a mind like a supercomputer, was already 3 moves ahead of everyone. The game was changing, the pieces were repositioning, and this time, when the dust settled, the truth would be the only thing left standing. The next 2 weeks blurred into a fever of activity conducted in shadows and stolen moments. Victoria provided access to Harrison Industries' internal systems, and Emma's programs devoured the data like wildfire consuming dry timber. Marcus coordinated their efforts, cross-referencing discoveries, building a timeline that stretched back not 7 years but 15. They met in unlikely places: empty parking garages, 24-hour diners at 3 in the morning, a library basement that closed at midnight but had a maintenance entrance Emma had discovered. Victoria arrived at each meeting looking more exhausted, the polished veneer of the confident CEO cracking to reveal someone terrified and determined in equal measure. "I found the communications," Victoria said at their latest meeting, held in Marcus's apartment after Emma had ostensibly gone to bed. She was actually in her room with headphones on, listening to every word through the baby monitor Marcus thought he'd disabled. Encrypted emails between David Chen and Carolyn Harrison going back 12 years. They've been planning this since before Richard Harrison died. Marcus accepted the flash drive Victoria offered. Richard, Thomas's son. He died in a car accident. That's what everyone thinks. Victoria's hands shook as she poured herself coffee from Marcus's ancient coffee maker. But I found insurance investigation reports that were buried. The accident was suspicious. Brake lines that might have been tampered with. Witnesses who reported seeing Richard's car being serviced by an unknown mechanic the day before he died. The investigation was closed after Carolyn provided an alibi and character witnesses. But the investigator's notes suggest he wasn't satisfied with the conclusion. The implications hung heavy in the air. "You're saying they killed him?" "I'm saying it's possible. Richard owned 30% of Harrison Industries. When he died, those shares passed to Carolyn. She immediately began voting them in ways that aligned with David Chen's interests. And 6 months after Richard's death, Carolyn and David were photographed together at a resort in the Maldives, looking very much like more than business associates. Emma appeared in her bedroom doorway, no longer pretending to be asleep. If they killed Richard Harrison, they're not just thieves, they're murderers. Victoria startled at the little girl's sudden appearance, but Marcus just sighed. He'd known Emma was listening. His daughter didn't miss anything. "We can't prove murder," Marcus said carefully. "The investigation was closed years ago. But we can prove fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy. We can prove they destroyed my company and they're in the process of destroying Thomas Harrison's company. That's enough to send them to prison for a very long time." "Is it enough, though?" Emma moved to the table where they'd spread out documents and printouts. "Because if they killed once, they'll kill again to protect themselves. If we expose them, we become targets." The child's words, spoken with such matter-of-fact clarity, chilled the room. Victoria looked at Emma with a mixture of fear and awe. "How old are you again?" 7. "But I've been thinking about worst-case scenarios since I was 4. Marcus wanted to apologize for that, for raising a daughter who had to think about danger and death before she'd lost her first tooth. But there would be time for apologies later. Right now, they needed to focus on the problem Emma had identified. "We need insurance," he said. "Multiple copies of all evidence, held by people we trust, with instructions to release everything if anything happens to any of us." "Who do we trust?" Victoria asked. "I don't have family. My friends are all professional contacts who'd drop me in a second if scandal touched me. I have someone. Marcus pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't called in 3 years. It rang 4 times before connecting. "Marcus?" The voice on the other end was female, surprised, cautious. "Is that really you?" "Hello, Sarah. I need your help." Sarah Chen, no relation to David, was the investigative journalist who'd tried to cover the Bennett Technologies scandal 7 years ago. Her editors had killed the story when Marcus's assets were seized, and he couldn't provide the documentation she needed. She'd always believed there was more to the story, and she'd told Marcus if he ever found proof, she'd run it. Now Marcus was about to test whether that promise still held. They met the next day at Sarah's apartment, a cluttered space filled with filing cabinets and whiteboards covered in notes for various investigations. Sarah, 42 years old with gray threading through her dark hair, listened to their presentation with growing amazement. "You've built a RICO case," she said when they'd finished. "Racketeering, conspiracy, fraud, money laundering. If even half of this holds up, you're talking about a federal investigation that could bring down dozens of people. Will you run it?" Marcus asked. "Run it? Marcus, I'm going to win a Pulitzer with this." Sarah's eyes gleamed with the particular hunger of a journalist who'd just found the story of a lifetime. "But we need to be smart. If we publish prematurely, they'll destroy evidence, flee the country. We need to coordinate with federal investigators, get simultaneous raids on offices and homes, freeze assets before they can be moved. How long will that take? 2 weeks, maybe 3. I have contacts at the FBI who specialize in white-collar crime. Let me make some calls." They left Sarah's apartment with a plan and a deadline. In 3 weeks, the story would break simultaneously across multiple platforms. Sarah's magazine, federal indictments, asset freezes. There would be no warning, no opportunity for David Chen and Carolyn Harrison to escape. But 3 weeks in a conspiracy was an eternity. Victoria returned to Harrison Industries, playing her role as dutiful CEO while knowing that every interaction with Carolyn or David could be her last before the hammer fell. Marcus continued his janitorial shifts, invisible and observant, watching for any sign that their investigation had been detected. Emma, meanwhile, had discovered something nobody else had noticed. She presented it to her father on a Wednesday evening, 2 weeks before the planned exposure. "They're accelerating their timeline," Emma said, her laptop displaying communication intercepts she'd pulled from Victoria's data dumps. "David Chen sent Carolyn a message yesterday. They're going to manufacture the scandal against Thomas Harrison this Friday. That's in 2 days. They moved their schedule up by 3 weeks." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Why?" "I don't know, but look at this." Emma pulled up a stock trading report. Someone's been buying short positions on Harrison Industries stock. Huge positions. Whoever it is stands to make hundreds of millions when the company's value crashes after the scandal breaks. Chen and Carolyn? The trades are hidden behind shell companies, but yes, probably them. They're going all in. This is their endgame. Marcus immediately called Victoria. "We have a problem." They met within the hour, this time at Victoria's apartment, a stunning penthouse that spoke to either family money or money from sources she'd never fully explained. Victoria listened to Emma's analysis with growing alarm. "If they're moving Friday, we can't wait 3 weeks for federal investigators," she said. "We need to warn Thomas now." "If we warn him now, we lose the element of surprise," Marcus countered. "Chen and Carolyn will know we're onto them. They'll destroy evidence, create alibis. If we don't warn him, his company crashes. Thousands of people lose their jobs, and his reputation is destroyed while we're still gathering evidence." Victoria's voice rose with frustration. "I thought this was about stopping them, not just catching them." "It's about both," Emma said quietly. Both adults turned to look at the 7-year-old who'd been silently typing on her laptop. "I have an idea. It's risky and it requires perfect timing, but I think it can work." She explained her plan. It was audacious, technically complex, and required several things to go exactly right. But it was also brilliant, the kind of multi-layered strategy that would either work perfectly or fail catastrophically. "That's insane," Victoria said when Emma finished. "It's genius," Marcus corrected. "It's both," Emma said with a small smile. "But it's also our only option if we want to stop them before Friday." They spent the next 48 hours in preparation. Emma worked 18-hour days on her laptop, building programs that would need to execute flawlessly. Victoria used her CEO access to position pieces for Emma's digital attack. Marcus coordinated timing and served as backup, ready to step in if any part of the plan failed. Friday morning arrived cold and gray, the weather matching the tension that thrummed through all three of them. Victoria went to work as usual, though she'd barely slept. Emma stayed home from school, her father calling her in sick while she made final preparations. Marcus went to Harrison Industries early, positioning himself on the 38th floor where Thomas Harrison's office was located. At 9:00 a.m., Carolyn Harrison arrived at Thomas's office with David Chen and 2 lawyers. Marcus, cleaning a conference room across the hall, watched through the glass walls as they presented documents to the elderly founder. He couldn't hear the words, but he could see Thomas's face go from confusion to shock to fury. This was it. The manufactured scandal. Falsified evidence showing Thomas had been embezzling funds for years. A PowerPoint presentation detailing the supposed crimes. A recommendation from the lawyers that Thomas resign immediately to minimize damage to the company. At 9:15 a.m., Emma executed phase 1 of her plan. Every computer in Harrison Industries simultaneously opened a window showing real-time financial data, the actual transactions flowing through Meridian Strategic Partners, the offshore accounts, the shell company structures. It was raw data, technical and damning, visible to every employee in the building. At 9:16 a.m., Victoria burst into Thomas Harrison's office. Marcus could see her speaking rapidly, gesturing to her phone, showing the elderly man something on her screen. Thomas's lawyer reached for his own device, eyes widening as he saw the data flooding across every computer in the building. At 9:17 a.m., David Chen realized what was happening. He pulled out his phone, likely trying to contact his tech people to shut down the data leak. But Emma had anticipated this. Every attempt to close the windows opened 3 more. Every attempt to block the network caused the data to spread further. At 9:18 a.m., Sarah Chen's story went live simultaneously on her magazine's website, The New York Times and The Wall Street Journal. Federal investigators received complete evidence packages with instructions to begin immediate asset seizure procedures. At 9:19 a.m., FBI agents entered Harrison Industries' lobby with warrants for David Chen and Carolyn Harrison's arrests. And at 9:20 a.m., Marcus Bennett stopped pretending to clean the conference room, walked across the hall in his janitor's uniform, and entered Thomas Harrison's office. "Mr. Harrison," he said quietly, "my name is Marcus Bennett. We need to talk." The office erupted into chaos. Carolyn screamed that this was a setup. David Chen tried to physically leave but found FBI agents at the door. The lawyers began calling their own lawyers. Victoria stood against the window, relief and terror warring on her face. But Thomas Harrison just looked at Marcus with ancient, knowing eyes. "Marcus Bennett, Bennett Technologies. I've been wondering when you'd appear." "You knew?" "I suspected. When a man with your intelligence and resources disappears for 7 years, there are only a few places he might go." Thomas gestured to a chair. "Sit. Let's discuss how to clean up this mess." And as FBI agents led David Chen and Carolyn Harrison out in handcuffs, as employees throughout the building processed what they'd just witnessed, as Sarah Chen's phones exploded with interview requests from every major media outlet, Marcus Bennett sat down across from the man whose company had bought pieces of his destroyed empire. "I want my company back," Marcus said simply. Thomas Harrison smiled. "I'm sure we can arrange something." The aftermath came in waves, each one bringing new revelations that made the original conspiracy seem almost quaint by comparison. David Chen's arrest triggered a cascade of revelations as his associates scrambled to cut deals with federal prosecutors. Carolyn Harrison, faced with evidence of her involvement in Richard Harrison's death, broke completely and provided testimony that implicated 14 other individuals in various schemes spanning 2 decades. The story dominated news cycles for weeks. Sarah Chen's reporting won her the Pulitzer she'd predicted, but more importantly, it sparked a national conversation about corporate fraud and the systems that enabled it. Harrison Industries' stock plummeted initially, but then recovered as Thomas Harrison took direct control, cleaned house, and implemented transparency measures that became a model for corporate governance. Through it all, Marcus Bennett remained largely in the shadows, known to prosecutors and journalists as a key witness but never seeking the spotlight. He had what he wanted: truth, justice, and the beginning of restoration. 6 months after the arrests, Marcus stood in the lobby of a building he'd once owned. Bennett Technologies no longer existed as an entity, but its assets had been traced, recovered, and were being returned to him as part of the federal restitution process. Thomas Harrison, true to his word, had facilitated everything, even offering Marcus a position on Harrison Industries' board, as thanks for exposing the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed his company. Emma, now 8 years old and still impossibly brilliant, walked beside her father as they toured the office space that would become the headquarters of Bennett Innovations, Marcus's new company, built on the foundation of what he'd lost but oriented toward a different kind of future. "It's smaller than what we had before," Emma observed, running her hand along a windowsill. "Smaller but ours. Completely ours." Marcus knelt down to his daughter's level. "Do you remember what I told you about starting over? That sometimes losing everything means you get to rebuild exactly what you want, instead of what you thought you should have." "Exactly." He kissed her forehead. "And this time, I'm building something that matters. Not just profit, but purpose. Technology that helps people, company culture that values people. Everything I should have built the first time." They continued their tour, Emma asking questions and making suggestions with her characteristic blend of childlike enthusiasm and adult-level strategic thinking. She'd been instrumental in designing the company's technical infrastructure, creating systems that would be both powerful and ethical, profitable and purposeful. Later that afternoon, Victoria Hayes arrived for a scheduled meeting. She looked different than she had 6 months ago. Still professional, still composed, but with something softer in her expression. The cruelty that had once defined her interactions had been replaced by a kind of thoughtful humility. "Marcus, Emma." Victoria greeted them both with genuine warmth. "The place looks amazing. Thanks to your recommendation about the architect," Marcus replied. After the scandal, Victoria had been cleared of all charges, but her reputation had taken a beating anyway. She'd resigned from Harrison Industries despite Thomas Harrison's offer to keep her on. Now she was consulting independently, helping companies implement ethical business practices, using her experience being set up as a cautionary tale for others. They settled in Marcus's new office, and Victoria pulled out a tablet. "I wanted to show you something." I've been investigating other companies that might have been targeted by networks similar to Chen's operation. I found 7 that show the same patterns: sudden scandals, orchestrated takeovers, assets dispersed through shell companies. Emma leaned forward, immediately engaged. 7 companies in how many years? 15 years. But I think there are more. I just haven't found them yet. Marcus studied the data Victoria had compiled. It was thorough, professional work. This is going to take years to untangle. I know. That's why I'm hoping you'll help. Both of you. Victoria looked between father and daughter. I can't undo what I did to you that day in the lobby. I can't take back my cruelty. But I can spend my career making sure what happened to you doesn't happen to other people. You want to make this your life's work, Marcus said slowly. I want to make it our life's work. You have the experience of being targeted. Emma has the analytical capabilities to trace financial crimes. I have the corporate access and understanding of how these schemes operate from the inside. Victoria's voice was passionate, alive in a way Marcus had never heard before. Together, we could be something unprecedented, a task force that exposes corporate conspiracies before they destroy lives. Emma was already nodding, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. Marcus felt something unfamiliar stir in his chest. Hope, maybe, or purpose, or simply the recognition that the worst thing that had ever happened to him might lead to the best thing he could do with the rest of his life. Okay, he said finally. Let's do it. They spent the next 3 hours planning. Emma's programs already adapting to process the new data Victoria had collected. Ideas flew back and forth, possibilities emerging. By the time Victoria left, they had the outline of something that could become extraordinary. A private investigation firm that specialized in exposing corporate fraud, funded by Marcus's restitution settlement, and operated with the precision of a military operation. That evening, after Emma had gone to bed, Marcus stood in the living room of their new apartment, no longer small and sparse but comfortable, filled with proper furniture and Emma's growing collection of books and computers. He'd come so far from that night 7 years ago when everything fell apart. He'd descended into poverty, humiliation, and the grinding daily survival of being someone nobody noticed. But he'd also learned things he never would have understood from the insulated height of wealth. He'd learned who he really was when stripped of status and money. He'd learned the value of patience, the power of observation, the strength that came from having nothing left to lose. His phone buzzed. A text from Thomas Harrison. Board meeting next month. Hope you'll attend. Your perspective is invaluable. Another text, this one from Sarah Chen. Working on a follow-up piece. Want to include Bennett Innovation story. Interested. And a final message from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Bennett, my company was destroyed 5 years ago in circumstances similar to yours. I read about your case. Can you help? Robert Martinez. Marcus smiled. The work was just beginning. The truth was just starting to emerge. And for the first time in 7 years, he felt like Marcus Bennett again. Not the janitor, not the victim, but the man who'd built something remarkable once and was about to do it again. Emma appeared in her doorway, illuminated by the glow from her bedroom. Daddy, are you okay? Better than okay, princess, come here. She padded across the floor and climbed into his lap. Too big for it really, but still his baby girl. They sat together in the quiet apartment, looking out at the city lights. Do you think about Mommy? Emma asked suddenly. Marcus tensed. They rarely discussed Emma's mother, the woman who'd abandoned them both in their darkest hour. Sometimes. Do you? Not really. I was too little to remember her much. Emma paused. But I think about what you said once, that people show you who they really are when things get hard. Mommy showed us she wasn't strong enough to stay. That's right. But we were strong enough. We stayed together. We survived. Emma looked up at her father with those impossibly wise eyes. And now we're going to help other people survive too. Yes, we are. They sat in comfortable silence, father and daughter, survivors of a conspiracy that had tried to destroy them and failed. The road ahead would have challenges, rebuilding a reputation, establishing Bennett Innovations, helping other victims of corporate fraud, but they would face those challenges together, just as they'd faced everything else. Because the greatest gift Marcus had received from losing everything wasn't the wealth he'd regain or the justice he'd achieved. It was the absolute clarity about what mattered. Not money, not status, not the respect of people who only valued surface accomplishments. What mattered was this, his daughter's hand in his, the quiet pride of having done the right thing, The knowledge that he'd faced the worst and come through it with his integrity intact. Everything else was just details. "Daddy?" Emma's voice was drowsy now, the long day catching up with her. "When I grow up, I want to be just like you." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. After everything they'd been through, after all the days he'd wondered if he was failing her by letting her grow up in poverty and uncertainty, his daughter wanted to be like him. "You're already better than me, princess. So much better." He carried her back to her room, tucked her into her proper bed in their proper apartment, and kissed her forehead. "Sleep well. Tomorrow we change the world. Tomorrow and every day after," Emma murmured, already half asleep. Marcus returned to the living room and looked out at the city one more time. Somewhere out there was Victoria Hayes, probably working late on her investigations, driven by her own need for redemption. Somewhere was Sarah Chen, chasing the next story, shining light into dark places. Somewhere were people like Robert Martinez, waiting for someone to believe them and help them fight back against the systems that had crushed them. And here was Marcus Bennett, no longer pretending to be a janitor, no longer hiding his light under a bushel. He was himself again, stronger, wiser, more purposeful than he'd ever been before his fall. The woman who'd humiliated him in that lobby 6 months ago had become an unlikely ally. The conspiracy that had destroyed him had been exposed and dismantled. The daughter he'd raised in poverty had become his greatest partner and his proudest achievement. Marcus Bennett had lost everything once. He'd been broken, dismissed, treated as invisible. But invisible men see everything. Broken men know how to rebuild. And men who've lost everything understand exactly what's worth fighting for. He picked up his phone and replied to Robert Martinez. "Yes, I can help. Let's talk tomorrow." Then he turned off the lights, checked once more on his sleeping daughter, and went to bed in his comfortable apartment in his rebuilt life. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles, new people who needed someone to believe their stories and fight for their truth. But tonight, Marcus Bennett could rest easy, because the janitor who'd cleaned up spilled wine while a CEO sneered at him had done more than survive his humiliation. He'd transformed it into purpose, and that transformation, more than any amount of money or status, was worth everything he'd endured to achieve it. The board meeting next month would be interesting. Thomas Harrison had already hinted that he wanted Marcus to take a leadership role in reforming corporate governance standards across the industry. Victoria would be there too, presenting her findings about other potential fraud networks. And Emma? She'd be in school, learning calculus and literature and all the normal things 8-year-olds with extraordinary minds studied. But she'd also be running her programs in the background, analyzing data, finding patterns, building cases that would eventually bring more conspirators to justice. The Bennett family had been through fire and emerged as tempered steel. They'd been tested in ways most people never experience and proven themselves capable of not just survival, but transcendence. As Marcus drifted off to sleep, his last thought was of that moment in the lobby when Victoria Hayes had looked down at him with such contempt, never imagining that the man she was humiliating was actually the architect of her eventual salvation. Life had a beautiful irony sometimes, and tomorrow that beautiful irony would continue as Marcus Bennett, former billionaire, former janitor, current CEO and corporate fraud investigator, would wake up and get to work changing the world one exposed conspiracy at a time. The fall had been devastating, but the rise was going to be legendary. Was.